Hello and welcome to this HTAi Interest Group webinar, Ethical Analysis at HTAi Agencies, Challenges and Opportunities. As we wait a few moments for further participants to join, I will share a few slides with you about the society. HTAi, this webinar is brought to you by the HTAi Ethics in HTA Interest Group. HTAi is the only global society championing equitable, responsive, and cutting-edge health technology assessment. HTAi memberships holds many benefits, including HTAi's premier events and specialized interest groups, free online access to the International Journal of Technology Assessment in Healthcare, HTAi resources and news, including a newsletter, bulletins, and international developments in HTA. Full access to the HTAi Educational Offer database, an international network of HTA experts, innovators, and influencers. For more information on membership benefits, visit our membership page on our website. HTAi interest groups are open to all members of HTAi. They act as a forum for HTAi members to network, exchange information, and collaborate on projects of mutual interest throughout the year. Visit the HTAi website for more information on our interest group. The next HTAi 2024 annual meeting will take place in Seville, Spain, from June 15 to 19th. For more information, visit the event website. We kindly ask participants to remain muted until invited to ask questions. Alternatively, please submit any question through the Q&A function of the Zoom meeting platform. Thank you again for joining us today. I will now hand over to the Ethics in HTA Interest Group to formally welcome and introduce today's topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola. Hello, welcome aboard. I'm very happy to be here. I am Pietro Refolo, Associate Professor of Legal Medicine in the Catholic University, and I am one of the two co-chair of the Interest Group on Ethics of the HTAi. I would like just to say hello and to say thank you to HTAi for this space. I'm very happy and very glad to collaborate to organize this event. And I hope this is the beginning of an history and of course of event where we can address the topic of ethical issue in HTA. So I leave the floor to my colleague, Bart Bloemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pietro, and welcome everyone. So my name is Bart Bloemen, also a co-chair of this interest group on ethics. Besides that, I'm a PhD candidate and principal lecturer in health technology assessment at the Orphan University Medical Center in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, where I'm conducting research and also teaching activities on the ethical aspects of HTA, which will of course be a central topic of this webinar. Going to briefly also give you an outline of this webinar and introduce you to the two speakers that we have invited to present their experience with conducting ethical analysis at HTA agencies. We'll also briefly introduce you the theme of this webinar and why we think this particular topic, doing ethics at HTA agencies, is important. So after my brief introduction, we first invited Renata Axler. She's ethics lead at CADTH in Canada, and she has many experience with conducting ethical analysis, actually being also in a position internally at a HTA agency. That's very interesting because we, up until this moment, don't see many examples of this. So we are very happy to hear from her what her experience is, also from a practical side with being in such a position. The second speaker that we have invited is Lars Sandman. He's a professor in healthcare ethics at the Linköping University in Sweden, but also having a position at the National Center for Priority Setting in Sweden, and many other assignments as an ethics advisor for many different governmental institutes. But we asked him to specifically focus on his experience in being an ethics advisor in the context of priority setting, which is also, of course, a very interesting area which HTA can be used. And it gives you, I think, also another example story of how ethics analysis can be informative to HTA. what are the challenges in conducting that. So before we move to our guest speeches, I will briefly give you an update of also what we as the interest group have been doing in the past about ethics in HTA. But I think, first of all, when we think about the role of ethics in HTA or its relation, I think we should just step back and think again about why do we actually have such a thing like health technology assessment. And this question was also nicely raised by this book by Pascal Leroux, The Problem of Health Technology. Because, I think that's a very nice starting point if we think about health technology, although it's fascinating and it can promise a lot also to patients. There are also some challenges. And reflecting upon that, we can also think, okay, what is then the sort of task for health technology assessment? And which aspects of it are to be seen as ethical. Looking back at the history also of regulating health technology, there are many historical cases. I just took one of the interesting or important ones, was the drug thalidomide, which was originally prescribed in the 50s already as a treatment, or was perceived to be a treatment for morning sickness during pregnancy. Unfortunately, what happened, what we realized is that children were born with all sorts of malformations of the limbs, as you can see in this picture of this child. And that was, among other cases, a reason also for policymakers and society in general to reflect upon, okay, how should we actually, or should we control the introduction of such technologies in the market and the prescription of such technologies to patients? And of course, realized also that there can be many, maybe unintended bad consequences of using drugs or other sorts of health technologies. But that's an historical case. But of course, also currently there are many technologies in development or firstly introduced in hospital or in the market. And that ranges from all sorts of developments in nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and also the cognitive sciences. Think about deep brain stimulation. Those kind of technologies are sometimes also summarized in the literature as NBIC. And I think when we think about ethical questions related to health technology, what often classically comes to mind are questions like, should we even want these type of technologies? Is it allowed to use them? Which particular applications should we allow? Like when you think about biotechnology, one of the fascinating things is human genome editing. And a classical way of thinking about ethical questions is, those are questions like, indeed, should we accept that you modify the human genome? But we think that, the ethics is much more than these type of moral or ethical dilemmas. First of all, what we unluckily see is also that the accumulation of all these sorts of technologies is one of the drivers of costs in healthcare. You see here a graph that reports on the cost of healthcare in the Netherlands. It's the total amount of healthcare expenditure per capita. And basically, the message is it's on the rise, and it not only brings problems in terms of funding healthcare and its affordability, but also in terms of the number of people needed to work in healthcare to provide all these fascinating technologies and treatments. But that is, of course, in itself not only a question about affordability, but it's also about equity and who gets or remains to have access to different healthcare services. And although we can develop a lot of interesting technologies and we can make them effective, when we can actually not afford it, then of course, we also have a problem. And specifically, if maybe particular people in society cannot afford it, that leads to a lot of also moral questions. And that's why we increasingly see, and that's of course also a task that is fulfilled by health technology assessment, is that we want to make a more explicit assessment of the sort of benefits that we can expect from a technology, but also take into account the cost that may definitely will have, or maybe risks or unintended consequences. So there are many challenges raised by health technology, also from a societal perspective. There can be unintended consequences, rising costs. Of course, what we also see is that there are different interests, and different stakeholders may have different views about which technology should have the highest priority, or is actually desirable or not. Also leading to a long list of policy questions that we may have when it comes to using health technology. And health technology assessment is one of the tools that increasingly in many countries is introduced as a sort of tool to help decision makers in making these difficult decisions and answering these difficult policy questions. And according to a recent definition of health technology assessment, which was developed by an international task group, also part of HTA International, is that it is an explicit method to determine the value of health technology at different points in its life cycle. And what the definition also mentioned is that the purpose of HTA is to inform decision making in order to promote an equitable, efficient, and high quality health system. So if you look at this definition, it's also recognized here that actually the goal, but also the content of health technology assessment is about values, is about what do we want to, and are we able to realize with health technology. So that already you see that there's a very close connection with HTA and answering, although maybe often that happens implicitly, ethical questions related to the value of health technology. So when we think about ethics in HTA, or in the context of HTA, I think what we should be aware of is that you can talk about ethics in HTA. What we mean by this is that there are all sorts of ethical issues that may be raised by particular health technologies, like the unintended consequence, the risks, but also questions about acceptability, the more sort of classical questions when you think about ethics. But there is also a category of ethical issues that's about the ethics of HTA itself. First of all, when you conduct an assessment in order to inform decision making, you have to make a lot of decisions. For example, which sorts of evidence do I take into account? What is the scope of my assessment? So when I'm assessing a drug, for example, what are the comparators that I should compare it with? Should I set a particular threshold on the cost of a technology, and how high should that threshold be? Those type of questions are ethical in nature, but you need an answer to those questions in order to conduct your assessment. The other thing is that HTA in itself is part of decision-making processes. In some countries, it's even a legal requirement for decision makers to conduct or ask for an HTA process and also take the results into account. So that means that you can also raise questions about the democratic legitimacy of, for example, scientists who are not elected informing policy makers. When we think about ethics, it's not just the ethical questions raised by technology itself, but also by the HTA process and the HTA methodology. Therefore, we would argue, and many other papers when it comes to ethics in HTA have also argued that ethics should be seen as an integral part of health technology assessment. So instead of thinking about having separate analysis of safety, clinical effectiveness, and cost effectiveness, and then maybe have a sort of special category of ethical questions, we would say that actually when you're doing a safety analysis or clinical effectiveness analysis or cost effectiveness analysis, you also are addressing or dealing with ethical questions. And an ethicist could be, or ethical expertise and an awareness of it could be very helpful also when conducting those type of analysis. There is also by many members of our interest group on ethics already extensive literature on these ethical aspects of HTA. that also provides some frameworks, methods, guidelines to address those particular issues. If you have an interest, I have some key reference here also on the slide. And also many reviews being done about ethical analysis in published HTA reports, and also specific methods proposed already for an integrative approach towards ethical analysis. So, this idea of having ethics embedded in all sorts of analysis that you normally conduct in HTA. For example, also the Renata HTA core model refers to this sort of integral role of ethics in HTA. And I myself and some other members of the interest group on ethics were also involved in an EU project called Validate. You see here a link to the website that proposes a framework for integrating ethics. Despite the availability of these methods and this extensive literature, we also note, and these reviews of ethical analysis and HTA reports also observe that the uptake at HTA agencies of these methods is still limited. There are some agencies, and we see perfect examples of that during this webinar, who have made a lot of effort in integrating ethics in their workflow. But in general, we still see that many HTA reports only mention safety, cost effectiveness, and effectiveness analysis without any explicit awareness of the ethical issues or the ethical questions that are either embedded in these analysis or sort of additional challenges related to the technology under assessment. So that's why we were thinking also as an interest group, what are reasons for this situation? How can we explain this? But also, if this is the case, how can we actually help those HTA practitioners working at an agency to make use of these methods for ethical analysis? So reflecting upon that, we are currently working as an interest group on a paper that touches upon this issue, raising the question, okay, what can we recommend to HTA practitioners in order to be able to conduct or make use of ethical analysis in their practice? What we are going to do is to sort of break that down into several steps that you could do, but also reflect with these steps upon what is the practical context, the situation in which these practitioners are doing the work. So first of all, how do you actually decide whether an ethical analysis is needed? And that requires, of course, being able to identify the ethical issues that needs such an assessment, taking into account, of course, that we know that many HTA agencies have limited time, also maybe capacity available to do these broad type of analysis. Secondly, when you're going to conduct an ethical analysis, who is going to conduct this? Do you really need specific formal training in ethics and methods for ethical analysis? Should you ask an ethicist outside of your agency, maybe from academics, to provide help? Or can an HTA practitioner without any formal training in ethics also do something him or herself? How to then evaluate the outcomes of such analysis? Could you actually appraise that? What if there are conflicts between moral principles or between views of different stakeholders? Do you have, as an HTA agency, the mandate to answer such questions? And finally, how to report on that? What should you include in an HTA report when it comes to ethics? Should you have a separate chapter, or should it be part of all the different chapters that you have in such a report? And how does it relate to the other type of analysis that you conduct? Those are 20 questions, but we hope to, given time, also provide some answers in a more practical paper. But it's also why we thought it is maybe interesting to organize a webinar like this, in which we invite people that are actually doing this type of work already at HTA agencies, to also learn from them and to initiate a sort of discussion together with you about how could we move this forward. So today we're going to present some real-life examples and experience of conducting such analysis at HTA agencies. Also to help us and you, hopefully, to discuss, to learn from these experiences and to move this forward. Again, if you have any questions during these presentations, you could already post them in the chat. And then I will, when in the discussion part of this session, make sure that those will be addressed. I'm now and I'm very happy to give the floor to Renata. She will present her experience with working at CADTH as an ethics lead.
Thanks very much, Bart. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, hopefully everyone can see my slides. And so I'm going to talk about some of the experiences of doing some of this ethics work that Bart was discussing and many of us are engaged in within the context of an HTA agency, specifically CADTH, which is Canada's Drug and Health Technology Agency. Before I formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nations in the land currently known as Ottawa in Canada. Also, some brief disclosures. I am an employee of CADTH, and CADTH is funded by contributions from the Canadian federal, provincial, and territorial ministries of health, with the exception of Quebec, and also receives application fees from the pharmaceutical industry for our reimbursement review processes, as well as our scientific advice program. A little bit more about CADTH before I get into some of the ethics work that we've been doing over the past few years. CADTH was initially established in 1989 and has now grown to an organization with over 250 employees and is engaged in a number of activities in the health technology space, including health technology assessment, as well as initiatives related to post-market safety and effectiveness, and other strategic initiatives in the broader drug and health technology space. In terms of where CADTH sits in the Canadian access and reimbursement pathway, and apologies to those in the audience, so this is quite familiar. So Health Canada is our regulator who looks at whether therapies, drugs are safe and do they work. CADTH then conducts analyses to look at whether therapies, how they compare with existing treatment options, and are they good value. There are then a number of bodies who look at prices and access considerations, with the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board looking at whether the price of therapies are excessive compared with some other developed countries, and then the public drug plans and the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance looking at whether drugs are needed and are they affordable. So within the CADTH process itself, how do we do some of this analysis of how does it compare with existing treatment options? We have reviews conducted internally by CADTH teams, usually consisting of clinical and health economic analysis, and increasingly so ethics analysis. And these reviews are then reviewed by multidisciplinary deliberative committees who will make recommendations that are used to inform the PMPRB and PCA negotiation processes. So I think this slide, is quite specific to the drug reimbursement space, but I just want to be aware that CADTH also conducts reviews on non-drug health technologies and medical devices as well. Okay, so near term and brief history of ethics at CADTH, although I think there's been quite a bit of growth just in the last sort of 3 to 4 years alone. So if we look sort of prior to 2020, we had an ethicist on the deliberative committees with a much longer history of that on our non-drug medical devices deliberative committee, and a more recent history of an ethicist on our oncology and non-oncology deliberative committees. And we had select ethics reports of technologies deemed to be ethically salient or complex contracted out externally. So at this time, there was no internal ethics capacity at CADTH. In 2021, the initial in-house ethics advisor position was brought into CADTH, and that person was me. That role was the first full-time in-house ethics role at CADTH. In 2022, there was a strategic initiative at CADTH that really expanded the reach of ethics, and that was the expansion of ethics reports into all complex reimbursement reviews. So this was a category of CADTH's reimbursement reviews that met several criteria, including cell and gene therapies, first-in-class therapies, and other drugs reviewed through expedited pathways. And each of these came with the sort of mandate to include an ethics report alongside them. So to accompany this kind of increasing demand within the organization, we also work to develop a methodology and approach for these CADTH ethics reviews, drawing on the vast scholarship on methodology for ethics in HTA. In 2023, the ethics lead position was created, and the ethics advisor position was also retained, and my brilliant colleague Anna Komperek now holds that role. So there are two of us working in an ethics capacity full-time within the organization. And a lot of the work we did last year was expanding our ethics reports and approaches across more reviews beyond the complex reviews, and really refining our approaches. And in 2024 and onwards, we're just a couple of weeks in, but we're working on ongoing adaptation and improvement of ethics analyses at CADTH, again, building on our internal capacity and process. So briefly, our current kind of approach to CADTH ethics analyses, and if you have a look on our website, at the CADTH website, at some of these products, you'll see this approach in our ethics reviews. We really look at ethical considerations across 4 broad domains. Those in the target population, so the population which the drug or technology is aiming to address or treat. So those might include equity considerations related to disparities in access to care, diagnosis, treatment, or outcomes, or other vulnerabilities related to clinical care or experience of the condition. We look at the ethics of evidence, including some implications of populations excluded from clinical trials, the meaningfulness of trial endpoints, and broader issues in the kind of ethics of evidentiary uncertainty in the evaluation and decision-making, and how that plays in to the decision-making that is inherent in HTA. We also look at ethical considerations in the use of the therapy, for example, limitations on equitable access for the therapy or technology, harms and benefits, and implications for clinical care. Our 4th domain or bucket is to look at impacts of the technology or therapy and on the distribution of healthcare resources more broadly, as well as other resource allocation considerations. So how do we do this work? We have drawn on a number of approaches to kind of build our methodology, primarily supported by a list of prompting questions tailored to the CADTH context from the UNETA core model ethics domain, as well as to sort of really bring to the forefront our interest in equity considerations. We drew on Benkalti et al.'s equity checklist for HTA to add some prompting questions that are specific to equity considerations to the broader ethics model. With work is supported by literature reviews, again supported by CADTH's Research Information Services team, with ethics-related search filters to search for relevant literatures. We engage closely with submitted materials from the sponsor or manufacturer of technologies or therapies, as well as the patient and clinician group input that is received by CADTH. CADTH also often brings clinical experts in to advise on reviews, and we also engage with those clinical experts and ask them specific questions relevant to the ethics of the technologies at hand. And in the reviews, we also collaborate closely with the clinical and economic review teams conducting the reviews. So on this next slide is a small sample of the many ethics reviews we've been able to complete since the initiation of the complex review process in 2022. We've actually completed over 20, and with many more counting and many more coming up, ethics reports as part of HTAs since January of 2022. And that's been a huge increase in volume compared to some of the previous work that we've done. So these are all drug technologies on your screen right now, either drugs for rare diseases or complex therapies, cell and gene therapies, radiopharmaceuticals, etc. And these reports are all available at this time on the CADTH website. And in doing so, we've really kind of grown the presence of ethics reports, but also been able to refine our approaches with each review. We've also been able to innovate in some of the ethics reviews that we've done. And I've got 3 examples of a number of examples here. One being our approach to reviews for CAR-T therapies or chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapies, which are often used in the blood cancer space. Given the number of these technologies that CADTH had received, rather than repeating an ethics report from scratch for each review, we actually developed a kind of summary report that could be applied across CAR-T therapies, so an ethics report for a class of therapies, and then each review is accompanied by a shorter list of supplementary issues to the specific drug or technology at hand, with the overall kind of end goal or effect of reducing repetition and building efficiencies within the organization. We've also done a number of collaborative reviews with other HTA agencies, and I've posted one here that we did in collaboration with Ontario Health, looking at intrathecal drug delivery systems for cancer pain. And in this one, we were able to leverage our CADTH-built expertise to co-conduct analyses with a partner organization, and ideally to build capacity across organizations and increase the reach of ethics beyond the walls of CADTH. And the third example I have here was another interesting one, which was our participation in CADTH's recent emergency department overcrowding review, which, as many of you are aware or have been touched by, is a serious and significant health system issue that is affecting emergency departments and patients everywhere. And so instead of conducting a standalone ethics analysis for this review, we actually integrated ethical considerations across a number of components of the reviews. And we also leveraged non-ethicist reviewers to do a lot of the ethics work. While the ethics team ourselves, we provided prompting questions and revised and reviewed final drafts, but the work of the ethics analysis was actually done by reviewers who were doing the other components of the review, but were not sort of formally ethics trained reviewers. And in doing so, we really aim to kind of build ethics capacity internally and also demonstrate a distributed responsibility to engage with ethical issues. So through our ethics reviews, we've been able to highlight ethical considerations in the technology under review, in the process of HTA itself. So this is kind of the ethics in and of that Bart was referring to in his presentation. So for example, primarily by looking at the ethics of evidence and how we manage uncertainty in evidence, that's really a kind of look at the ethics of HTA itself. We've also been able to hone our analyses specifically to the Canadian context by leveraging these multiple internal sources. In many ways, the process of conducting these reviews kind of socialized ethical analyses across review teams. We were internal to the organization. We worked closely with the clinical and economic reviewers from start to finish of each HTA, and ethics became kind of a routine part of doing health technology assessment. And our outputs have been kind of appreciated and valued by the deliberative committees and drug plans, and we are continuing to refine our approaches. If I have to characterize the work that we did to expand ethics at CADTH, it's kind of this 3-pronged and ongoing work that we've been doing. Firstly, at the kind of macro level, there was the work to demonstrate the value of ethical considerations in decision making, and why ethics should be present in decision making and in health technology assessment. There were also several kind of meso level work to promote the legitimacy of ethics as a core component of HTA rather than something external or exceptional. And then I could say at the kind of micro level, there was this negotiation of organizational practices to include ethics. So being on the right emails and in the right meetings at the right time to do our work. That some of the key successes of this work that we've done have been the ability of the work that we've done and being embedded within an HTA organization has really allowed for the continuous evolution and improvement of our ethics reports to meet organizational and health system needs and really engage in a responsive ethics practice. And having on-site integrated and embedded ethicists really enabled HTA practitioners and leaders across the organization to see ethics as an integrated and routine rather than exceptional component of HTA. Ethics as core rather than external and exceptional. This is ongoing work, but we are making some headway in this domain. We also were able to position ethics as a collaborative endeavor with roles taken on by clinical and health economics reviewers, our research information services team, our patient engagement team, and beyond. And this sort of increased our recognition and ability of those not formally trained in ethics to contribute to ethics analysis. And again, positioning ethics as this core and routine component of HTA. So as a sort of final thoughts, ethicists have a key role to play in articulating values, building capacity, and examining norms and values across HTA domains. And one of the key challenges we're facing now is there's been such a increase in the demand and recognition for ethics across CADTH reviews that we are becoming limited by the capacity of our team and the work that we can do. And so we're really working towards developing transferable materials and approaches that can be used across the organization. And so finally, ethicists embedded into an HTA organization can make ethics routine, collaborative, and attuned to organizational and health system needs and context. And here's my contact information. And I am going to pass it over to Lars. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Renata, for this interesting insight into the ethics of CADTH. I'm also going to share some slides. Thank you for the invite, and thank you for the opportunity to say something about ethics analysis and priority setting in HTA. So, as Bart said before, I'm a professor of healthcare ethics. I'm a director of the National Center for Priorities in Health at Linköping University, but I'm also part of reimbursement boards in Sweden. And I will start to some extent where Bart started, to say something about the background here. Of course, I mean, one of the things that we are struggling with, and Bart also told us about that, is scarce resources. And scarce resources will force us to choose which health interventions to offer patients, basically to prioritize. And of course, when we want or need to prioritize, that will give rise to a number of important value issues. So what should characterize patients who get access, and of course those who don't get access? How should we think about things like needs and preferences? And if we talk about needs, we have to consider a number of value issues about how to assess quality of life, life length, how should we balance those? Should age be taken into account? Should rarity of the group be taken into account, etc.? And of course, what should characterize the health interventions in terms of benefits, side effects, costs, cost effectiveness, evidence, etc. So as Bart has given you a very good picture of, those are value-infested matters. And of course, when we talk about priority setting, we are also facing something that is difficult to some extent, so that we have to say perhaps yes to one group and then say no to other groups, etc. We have then, as Bart also told us, established a number of ethical frameworks to help us address such value or normative issues. And I would take the opportunity here in this short hours to say something about a specific case in Sweden, which I think is a kind of a success story from where an ethics analysis actually made a difference to the priority setting in Sweden. So just to give you a short background of the Swedish situation. In Sweden, we have a legal decision on an ethical framework for priority setting, what we call an ethics platform. 3 principles. We have a human dignity principle, which says something in terms of what we shouldn't take into account. So it's kind of a formal equality principle that should make us aware of only taking into account aspects that are relevant to the priority setting decision. We have a need solidarity principle that basically said that the greater the need of the patient population, the more of resources we should distribute to that population. And then we have a cost effectiveness principle saying that we should have kind of a reasonable relationship between cost and effect of the interventions we are reimbursing. And there is a rank ordering of these principles, which is interpreted in terms of that we can accept a worse cost effectiveness, a higher cost per effect for conditions with higher severity. So that's sort of the basic background. So a few years ago, well, maybe 15 years ago, there was a lot of discussion in Sweden whether we could use this framework to handle orphan drugs. There were coming a lot of orphan drugs on the market, or started to come orphan drugs on the market, of course, drugs for rare conditions. And the question arose whether we could accept a higher threshold, higher cost effectiveness threshold for orphan drugs in relation to the accepted thresholds we were having for drugs for common condition. This is not something that is mentioned in the legal documents. There is no discussion about this, and since the government decision on the legal principle was made in 1997, that was sort of before this evolution of orphan drugs came on the market. So of course, orphan drugs, that implies that there is a small market for the drug. And because there is a small market, and because return on investment has to be sort of distributed on a smaller population, they are generally likely to have a higher price and therefore worse cost effectiveness per patient. And we saw that these drugs had difficulty to meeting the cost effectiveness requirement we had in the Swedish system. So we were then at the National Center given a commission from the government to look into this, to do an ethics analysis of this issue. Could we actually use the ethics principles we had and that were established, and could they sort of allow us to have a higher threshold for rare conditions and orphan drugs? And we then look at the human dignity principle, and the human dignity principle says that, well, we shouldn't allow irrelevant aspects to influence equal access to healthcare, and we should have equal access given equal conditions. So that seems to speak in favor of sort of disregarding the fact that we have market dynamics affecting the price of orphan drugs. We have the need solidarity principle saying that the higher severity, the more of the resources. And we had this rank ordering also between the need solidarity principle and the cost effectiveness principles, saying that even if we should take cost effectiveness into account, in order to tend to the needs of severely affected populations, we should allow a worse cost effectiveness, even if the sky is not the limit, so to speak. This gave us a background to actually arrive at the conclusion. Yeah, the platform and what the values it expresses gives us actually a reason to compensate for the fact that orphan drugs get a higher price generally on the market. That is, to accept a higher cost effectiveness threshold. But of course, that's not sort of the full story here. We also arrived at the conclusion there is obviously an opportunity cost to accepting this higher threshold. And we need to find sort of a reasonable balance for under which conditions we should allow this higher cost to be accepted in the Swedish system in order not to impact other patients in the system too much. And we therefore had a discussion whether we should look at the indications for specific drugs, and we arrived at the conclusion that, yeah, we have to also see too that over time, when an orphan drug gets more indications, the market increases, and the reason for accepting a higher threshold will therefore be less strong. So we need to see this from sort of over a time perspective when we talk about orphan drugs. This analysis, and therefore that's why I call it a success story. This analysis led to a change in the policy in Sweden, and since then we have accepted a higher threshold. We have since then just recently looked into this further to develop this way of thinking even more. In terms of more exactly defining which groups should be or which conditions and which drugs should be entered into this, etc. So there is constant analysis with sort of deepening the ethics analysis. And these are just a couple of publications that we have done on this academically, not just the Swedish reports. So just to let me reflect a few moments on why was this a success. Well, I think one of the important things here is, of course, that we have a well-established and also legal ethics framework. But even if you don't have a legal ethics framework, there was a basic acceptance for that this is an ethical issue. This is an important ethical issue, and therefore we need to find a way forward that will harmonize with the actual ethics framework. We can't do anything in this situation without looking into the ethics principle. And that's the implication, of course, is then you have to do an ethics analysis to sort of sort these things out. You can't just do a social preference study. That doesn't solve the ethical issue per se. So that is also that there was a sort of an acceptance that an ethics analysis was at least one part of the decision basis we needed for changing or for potentially changing the policy. We did the ethics analysis within the frames of the framework, so we stuck to the principles. We adapted it to a concrete problem, and it was in line with the practice for the framework. So that was also important to be aware of. How do we actually use this framework? What does it imply? And how will this sort of way of thinking harmonize with the actual framework? And finally here, I think one of the also reason was that it wasn't sort of overly abstract or theoretical. We weren't sort of involving a lot of abstract theoretical or philosophical theories, but we stuck with actually referring to the frameworks, to what was known by people about the framework. So those were couple of things that I think led to success. And just finally saying something of then drawing on this, what are the potential obstacles for an ethics analysis actually making a difference? And I think Renata pointed to a number of important issues here, but I think there are a few things that can be sort of drawn as conclusions from this experience here. So about the healthcare system, I think it is important that that the problem is accepted as an ethical problem among decision makers. I've seen a number of examples also in my own career when I've been commissioned to do ethics analysis in different situations, that the ethics analysis might risk being more of a window dressing than actually something that might change the decision. So it must be taken seriously by decision makers that ethics is sort of integrated, as we've heard before. A problem here, of course, might then be that there is a lack of commonly accepted ethical principles of frameworks. As Bart showed, there are a number of frameworks out there, and if the decision maker doesn't sort of agree on a specific framework, that might cause problem. What kind of conclusions can we draw? Would we arrive at different conclusions using another framework, for example? And drawing on that, I think also we have to look into, if we have a framework, the framework might sometimes be too open or lacking in statements of how different criteria relate to each other. So, for example, we might have a framing saying that we should consider patient need and we should consider patient autonomy. But that might be too open. What does that imply in a concrete situation? We might face a conflict between patient need and patient autonomy. How do we solve that? Is there a practice that we can sort of relate to? And the more sort of concrete and the more definite the framework is, the more help we will have of that in an actual analysis. And then I think there are a couple of things to say about the person doing the ethical analysis, and especially if we use academic ethicists, there they might have an advantage having sort of internalized ethics, as in Renata's case. So one of the problems we have seen in Sweden is that you might get commissioned to do an ethics analysis, but you don't really address the practical problem. You want to do something more. You start challenging the whole underlying field. For example, someone is commissioned to do an ethics analysis on assisted reproductive, on a specific assisted reproductive technique, and start challenging the whole field of assisted reproduction, which is not very helpful for the decision maker. And another aspect here, which I've touched upon, is that you use especially your cherished abstract philosophical theories because you want to do something that feels meaningful for you as an academic, but that might not actually address and be helpful for the decision making. It gets too complicated or too much distinctions, etc. So I think there are some aspects that we need to take into account if we want these ethics analyses to actually make a difference. At the same time, I want to relate the message that they are and they can actually be of very much help and change policy. Thank you. And back to Bart.
Thank you very much, Lars and also Renata, for your interesting presentations. Meanwhile, I've looked already at the chat whether there are any questions by the audience. One that I can already, I think, raise to both of you is a question about setting a cost effectiveness threshold. And the question is about whether we should either differentiate the threshold between drugs that, for example, impact only quality of life and those that have an impact on prolongation of life, or should we, instead of differentiating this threshold, take an approach like multi-criteria decision analysis, MCDA? I don't know if one of you has any thoughts on this question.
Just a short comment from me. I think there is a risk in sort of integrating too much of the value decision into the health economy analysis and the threshold. I think sometimes it's better to sort of have, perhaps if you have one threshold for all, but and allow other of the ethical aspects to be taken into account separately in order to be visible in the decision and how we relate to that. So generally, I think it might be actually a good idea to have more of a multi-criteria than try to sort of make it all into one quantitative assessment. But that's, I think, a general take. And I think that would also relate to the question in here.
Renata, you would like to respond to this?
I think just to add to that, I mean, I will just be upfront and say I've preached about socializing ethics across the organization and the need for everyone to learn more about ethics. And when I see questions like that, I recognize that I need to learn more about health economics and fuller understanding of these scales. However, I would say that, you know, I think the first question that I would ask or look at in the question like that would be the meaningfulness of the EQ5D scale, the meaningfulness of multi-criteria decision analysis, the components of that, the impact of that on how health technologies are valued at the level of patients, clinicians, decision makers, payers, and beyond. So I think, you know, we can look at these kind of micro decisions around, you know, quality versus quantity of life and think about them, but we can also think about the scales that are utilized to produce these analyses. And I think this goes back to this kind of differentiation between the, you know, ethics in and the ethics of HTA as well. So instead of answering the question, I sort of like to unpack the question first.
Yeah, thank you. I see a new specific question for Renata. Can you say more about the experience of involving non-ethicists in ethics work? Did you find people were meaningfully able to build their capacity for ethical analysis? And what do you see as the role of the ethicist, given those developments?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So this is certainly something we're in the process of building and doing, and we're only in our second review, large review where we're doing this work, although we have some partial work around this as well. So I think there's multiple parts to this. So one thing that I've seen is, one, there's been just an increased recognition for the need for ethics. So the need, and then across sort of non-ethics trained practitioners. Then there's the how do we do ethics analysis. So I gave the example of CADTH's emergency department overcrowding review. So as I mentioned, our ethics team did provide tools and review, so front end and back end support for non-ethics trained reviewers to do those types of questions. However, I think there's actually a benefit in doing this, because we are asking reviewers who are conducting other parts of the analysis and were really integrated in the literature that they were reviewing, in the other components of the review, in combing through the data, to then not just list the data in the way that they normally would, but also look at the ethical elements of that data as well. So in one way, there's also just the efficiencies there in terms of asking those already doing the work to just add on more. The ethicists within the organization certainly did have a role in supporting that. And again, as I say, in kind of reviewing, I certainly take the point, if ethics is everywhere, and everyone can do ethics, then what does the ethicist do? And I think there is still this ongoing kind of important role in, doing some of that training, capacity building, but also a lot of that refining work as well, and the sort of parsing of the values inherent in the kinds of decisions we make and in the kind of questions we ask. And I see Lars has his hand up as well.
Yeah, can I add to that? I mean, I have experience of developing an ethics framework for the Swedish health technology agency, which is now used for non-ethicists and project leaders, etc., in the much the same way that you, Renata, tell you about. And I think that's been helpful. I mean, it raises awareness in the project leaders and the actual project groups. They might systematically go through with knowledge of the literature, etc., as you say. And I think one of the key points there is that, I mean, in many cases, and perhaps in modern projects, there aren't any really challenging ethical questions, and therefore we don't sort of waste the resources of the ethicists. And instead, they are able to handle this. They are also able to identify, here we have a challenging ethical question where we need something more in depth in terms of ethics. So I think there is a lot of advantage in doing it that way, actually. So, but as you say, Renata, you might need to do some training and do some consultancy work to help people to actually sort of understand the framework, of course, and understand the way it should be interpreted, etc. But I see great advantages in that.
Yeah, thank you. Nice that you both also mentioned training, because the first remark in the chat box was about including HTA in the different university programs. That would be helpful to also increase the acceptance as HTA, as a practice to be used in decision making. What are your thoughts on that? Would that also maybe specifically for ethics in HTA be something that is important and be helpful? And how is it actually, for example, in Sweden, when you are trained as an HTA practitioner, is ethics part of that program, or is there an official program?
There isn't an official program in Sweden, unfortunately. So the people sort of tend to have other backgrounds when they go into this field, and that therefore they might have some ethics due to having like a clinical background or something like that, but not very systematic. I think it's important, not at least because doing ethics is quite different from doing other type of research, empirical research, and you have to have an understanding that ethics is more than just thinking about things or having an opinion about things. There is a sort of a systematic approach to ethics in terms of analysis and trying to apply principles consistently, etc., etc. So I think we need to train people also in this, not perhaps to do ethics analysis, full-fledged ethics analysis, but at least to have an understanding of what is an ethics analysis and what does that actually contribute with in an HTA.
Yeah, thank you, Lars. Renata, how is that in Canada from your perspective?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we are seeing more of this. I mean, I certainly get asked to give a number of guest lectures on this in HTA courses, but I think it's the training that takes this kind of ethics as exceptional, something that is separate and needs to be integrated, something that is external, and does the work of making, ethics the other component, the other core component, the routine component of HTA. So it is this kind of socialization or training that needs to happen from early HTA training, and I think that's quite diverse in different countries and systems through to practice as well. And I don't see any need to kind of keep ethics preciously in the hand only of ethicists, but I do think it is a distributed responsibility to do that work.
Thank you, Renata.
Okay, thank you very much, considering we have finished the time now. Thank you again to HTAi for the opportunity. It's this very interesting opportunity. Thank you to Lars and to Renata. And my request is to ask one key message from Lars and from Renata about how we have to take into consideration ethical analysis in HTA, one word or one sentence. Thank you.
Should I start? I think the main task is to get people to understand that ethics is, to some extent, the core of what we're doing. That sort of and taking a stand on the ethical issues is not just window dressing. It's not just the icing of the cake. It's actually the core of what we are doing, and therefore ethics analysis and what we will do in ethics and the standpoints we make in ethics should make a difference to, in a sense, any decisions.
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree with that, and I think there are a number of methodologies, frameworks, and approaches that are out there. So really, it is a question of adoption and acceptance of that within the practices of HTA. And I think there have been a number of barriers to that. Some of them ideological, epistemic, what have you. But I think this can happen through, I do believe that this integration and acceptance of ethics as core can happen through practice, and it happens through the growing of ethics practice within organizations. Those out there who don't have 1 to 2 PhD trained ethicists on your team, just try it, give it a go and try to integrate ethics analysis within some of your HTAs where you think that would be important, or ask those questions of why, or what does this mean, or what are the implications of that, what values are at play, and just kind of see what happens.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you, Lars, for your nice presentation and your thoughts, sharing it with us. Thank you all for participating in this webinar. Yeah, just this slide as a final remark that also our interest group, of course, will keep on organizing activities. And if you want to know more, keep an eye on that, specifically the workshop that we organize pre-annually at the annual meeting of HTAi this year in Seville. Yeah, thank you all. Have a nice day, and see you hopefully back soon at other activities of our interest group.